You may find yourself living in a shotgun shack, and you may find yourself in another part of the world, and you may find yourself behind the wheel of a large automobile, and you may find yourself in a beautiful house with a beautiful wife, and you may ask yourself, well, how did I get here?
Letting the days go by, let the water hold me down. Letting the days go by, water flowing underground into the blue again. After the money's gone, once in a lifetime, water flowing underground.
And you may ask yourself, how do I work this? And you may ask yourself, where is that large automobile? And you may tell yourself, this is not my beautiful house. And you may tell yourself, this is not my beautiful wife.
Letting the days go by, let the water hold me down. Letting the days go by, water flowing underground into the blue again. After the money's gone, once in a lifetime, water flowing underground.
Same as it ever was. 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 Water dissolving and water removing. There is water at the bottom of the ocean. Under the water, carry the water. Remove the water at the bottom of the ocean. Water dissolving and water removing.
Letting the days go by, let the water hold me down. Letting the days go by, water flowing underground into the blue again, into the silent water, under the rocks and stones. There is water underground. Letting the days go by, let the water hold me down. Letting the days go by, water flowing underground into the blue again. After the body's gone, once in a lifetime, water flowing underground.
You may ask yourself, what is that beautiful house? You may ask yourself, where does that highway go to? And you may ask yourself, am I right? Am I wrong? And you may say to yourself, my God, what have I done?
Letting the days go by, let the water hold me down. Letting the days go by, water flowing underground into the blue again, into the silent water, under the rocks and stones. There is water underground. Letting the days go by, let the water hold me down. Letting the days go by, water flowing underground into the blue again. After the money's gone, once in a lifetime, water flowing underground.
Same as it ever was. Same as it ever was. Same as it ever was. Look where my hand was. Time isn't holding up. Time isn't after us. Same as it ever was. 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 Yeah, Twister comes. Here comes the Twister. Same as it ever was. Same as it ever was. Same as it ever was.
It's July 28th, 2013, and shalom, shalom. Sure missed you. It's been a few weeks. Had some time today. It's Sunday to squeeze in a podcast. Had a day off today. It's been rare. Been working 12 to 18 hours a day, being blessed. Thank you, Abba, for the job and the opportunity to pay back my debts. But just kind of trying to squeeze time, and it's that season. Any time off, looking to spend time with Abba, reading the Word, doing some studies, spending time with the family. As soon as this podcast is over, I'm going to take the family out. We're going to go watch a drive-in. I think Monsters, Inc. is playing tonight, so we're going to have some popcorn and soda and just hang out together and take the kids out. They've been home all week and not having their dad around, and sometimes their mom. Mom works too, so gonna try to go make some memories and spend time with the family. So, love you guys. Glad you're listening. I thought that song was appropriate. Once in a lifetime. We have one shot, one chance. And if you listen to those words real carefully, there's verses in there that, show you that life's just unfulfilling. That, beautiful house, big large automobile, beautiful wife. How did I get here? It's meaningless. And a lot of you can understand that, like whether it be vacations, whether it be gambling. In my case, it could be CDs, music videos, could be all kinds of stuff, restaurants, new things that you just want to do and try out that just never fulfill, and keeps wanting to want more and more and more and more. There's only one who fulfills. And instantly, probably a lot of you just think of that scripture in John 4 with the woman at the well that he meets, and he says, everyone drinking of this water shall thirst again. Well, there's layers to that. He could be talking about that well and that thirst of just plainly drinking that water, but I really believe there's a meaning to it, drinking of the world. And the day and age that we're in, we could be drinking of sports, we could be drinking of working out, we could be drinking dating, could be all kinds of things that are unfulfilling where you're always seeking more or something different. But Yeshua says, but whoever drinks of the water I give him shall certainly never thirst, and the water that I give him shall become in him a fountain of water springing into everlasting life. Springing to everlasting life. So life's forever, once in a lifetime. Once in a lifetime. We wanna live forever. We want to be eternally with the Son, with Yeshua. And I just thought that song was appropriate. But again, our flesh is weak. The Spirit's willing, but our flesh is weak. That's Matthew 26. So it's through being watchful and pray. So if you're already a believer and you're like me and you fall down and you give into those needs to try to fulfill other than Yeshua, you repent, confess, and get back to prayer and stay vigilant. That word watchful is, I believe it's, I gotta get it here. I thought I knew it. Gregorio. What is it? Gregorio. Greek words are tough, but it's Strong's number G1127, Gregorio. And it's be vigilant. And to me that means keep your head on a swivel. Don't get sleepy. Don't get comfortable. A lot going on in the news the last couple weeks. Eric Snowden. That whole ordeal. I don't know about you, but I'm getting tired of hearing about it. Give that guy a country and just get over with it already. You got the Pope in Brazil and all the millions following him, and you also have a big resistance there, so it's been kind of in the news. You also have the Israel and Palestinian peace talks led by John Kerry, so that could be something there to keep an eye on. Might turn out to be nothing, but just keep your eye on it. And also the big news last week, you got George Alexander Lewis, the Prince of the UK, and all their little rituals that they do, and I encourage you to go YouTube that out and look at all the hidden rituals they were doing for the public eye and the meaning behind, the hidden meaning that's behind all that with the Illuminati. So there's more to meets the eye with that, and I'll have some more on my website. And if you haven't checked it out on my website, go into teachings and podcasts. In case you're listening to this on Podomac.com, go to Returning to the Truth, go to the teachings and podcast. You got a whole section on the New World Order, Illuminati, the pagan feasts. Spend some time in it. There's a lot of videos there, and it'll open up a new understanding of things if you already don't know what the Illuminati or don't know what I'm saying. But yeah, it's been a while. I'm going to keep this short. I'm going to try to squeeze in another podcast here tomorrow. Spirit's given me a few teachings that I want to put out. Tonight's going to be Bill Cloud's. It's a flashlight message, and it's a very important message on how we're supposed to walk and what we're supposed to do. And a lot of us, including myself, fell there. So I think this is a really neat message. I seen this live at a conference last year, and I found it on the internet and wanted to share it with you guys. And then the next I want to get into is how to witness, and there's some great videos on witnessing the Hebrew Messiah, our beloved Yeshua. So I think that's important for every single one of us, no matter what your gifting is. There's always an opportunity to witness. So we got to be vigilant and keep our head on a swivel with that opportunity. You never know. Anyways, love you guys, and prayerfully see you shortly, and may you be blessed. And again, returningtothetruth.com. Spend some time in there. There's a smorgasbord. There's all kinds of stuff in there. Go to the Torah teachings down in the bottom. You got worship music, and hopefully I'll be putting a lot of good stuff up there. I got some ideas that I want to do. Working all these hours like I am just for a season, and right now I know it's a test to show Abba that I could be a good steward of time, and be all about Him when it counts, because He is everything, and we got to seek Him every day. You guys could do it through His Spirit, through prayer, through reading the Word, and loving each other, serving each other. Love you guys, and we'll talk to you next time.
How's everybody doing? Doing good? There's a lot of y'all out there. Well, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Hope everybody's having a great time. You glad to be in Jacksonville? Hooah! All right, well, it's a pleasure to be here with you. It's a pleasure to be at this conference, the first Hebraic Roots Network Conference. Wow. So it is my privilege to be able to get to take the next 74 minutes and 23 seconds and share some things with you. And I'm going to, if you've been with me before, you know I like to wander. So I'm just going to kind of walk around and kind of see everybody and talk. And what we're going to do in just a moment, we're going to turn to Exodus chapter 13. Let me go ahead and turn over there before I forget to do it. But before we do, I want to share some thoughts with you and kind of set up what I want to talk about tonight. I have, for the last 23, 24 years, something like that, at one level or the other, been part of what we used to call Jewish roots. How many remember those days when it was Jewish roots? And then we began to understand the distinctions between Judah and Israel and the house of Israel and things. And then it became Hebrew roots. And then it became the Messianic movement. And it's called other different things. But for 20-something years, at one level or the other, I've been involved with this. And I know that there are others who have been involved a lot longer than that. But the point is this. Over those years, like you, I have seen a lot of stuff. And the more I learn, the more I come to realize, for me anyway, that it's coming back to basics. It's coming back to the fundamentals that are the most important thing. And so as I come to that place, here's one thing I begin to realize, and maybe you'll agree with me on this, and that is that there are a lot of people in this movement as they come in with all the zeal and all the energy and sometimes the anger and frustration. We have allowed ourselves at times to become addicted to knowledge. I remember, thank you, two of you. There you go. Thank you very much. I remember I remember back in January, me and Brad and Rico were on a teaching cruise out of Long Beach, California, going down to the Mexican Riviera. It was tough, but someone had to do it. But I remember there was this lady that walked up to me. She said, Bill, what new things do you have to share with us this time? And I thought about it for just a second. And I looked at her, and she didn't mean anything by it. But I said, well, what if I don't share anything new with you? What if I never share anything new with you ever again? What if nobody ever shares anything new with you ever again? It is my opinion, folks, that the Creator has given us enough to chew on that's going to last us a lifetime. All right? And besides that, the Messiah told us that every scribe who's instructed in the kingdom of heaven is like a householder who goes into his house and he brings out treasures both old and new. So what I want to do tonight is I want to share with you some things that you already know. I don't know that I'm going to share anything new with you, but I hope that by the time we're done, the things that we are going to share is, with His help, it's going to be more than knowledge. It's going to be more than information. It's going to be more than those things that make us go, wow. Because when you hear something that makes you go, wow, your brain says, that was nice. I'd like another, please. And so we go around looking for those things that make us go, wow. And before you know it, we're, wow, that's not enough. I need a bigger wow. Come on, man, give me a fix. I need a wow right now. We get addicted to wow. And so we become hungry and we get addicted to knowledge. But I want to remind you that when the adversary come to seduce the woman, it was not with sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Here's what he did. Hasn't God said that you may freely eat of all the trees of the garden? Oh, well, we can eat of all those other trees, but this one that's in the midst of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, we're not to eat it, we're not to touch it, lest we die. Oh, you're not going to die. It's just that he knows that when you eat the fruit from this tree, you're going to know everything he knows. And who doesn't want to know everything the Creator knows? Guess what? Our Creator, He says, I don't change. The Messiah is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And even though the text does not tell us this, it is my opinion that the adversary is pretty much the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. He doesn't really change his methodologies either. In other words, you know what he's still trying to get people hooked on? Knowledge. So we thirst and we hunger for knowledge, and that's okay, except that knowledge in and of itself has a tendency to do something. You know what it is? To puff us up, to make us proud, to get us looking down our noses at other people who don't have the knowledge that we have. So now, I want us to imagine, and it won't be really hard in this room, except for me with these lights shining down on me. I want us to all pretend that we are sitting in complete darkness. There's no light whatsoever. And our objective is to come out of the darkness, get outside where there's light. But the problem is there are all these chairs and wires and cameras and obstacles, and to grope around in the darkness in that kind of an environment, somebody's going to get hurt, somebody's going to trip and fall. We don't want that to happen. So we, nevertheless, have the goal, let's say mandate even, to come out of darkness into light, because we're not children of the dark, right? But of the light. So how are we going to attain our goal? Well, it just so happens that here in my hand, I have a flashlight that kind of looks like a microphone. And this flashlight gives us the potential to come out of darkness into light. But if I'm just holding the flashlight, then really it's not functioning in its purpose. It's not serving the goal, or it's not serving the purpose for which it was made. Because for me just to hold the flashlight does nothing. So what must I do? Turn it on. That was a hard question, wasn't it? We got to turn it on now. So when we turn it on, there's a beam of light that comes out of the end of the flashlight. And now we really have the potential to fulfill our goal, because this light brings things out of darkness. And so when I shine this light on the stage or the ceiling or what have you, when that light hits it, I can tell you what it is and I can describe it for you. I can define it and I can give you all the details about it. And just like anybody else, I want to kind of look around and see what's in the room. And as I do this, I kind of get addicted to that. I'm going to look some more. I'm going to see how much there is out there for me to define for you, to describe to you, because that's what light does. That makes it possible. But if all I'm doing is going around this all throughout the room, just describing things to you, just defining them for you, does that put us any closer to our goal? What are you saying? Thank you. All right, so here's what all this is to say. The flashlight represents knowledge. You see, we need knowledge. My people perish for lack of. But knowledge in and of itself isn't enough. We need something more than knowledge. The knowledge has to be turned on, and that's understanding. It's one thing to know what the Scripture says. It's another thing entirely to understand what the Scripture says. There's a gentleman that I've met him a few times before. He's a very nice man, has a television program, and he will quote you verse after verse after verse after verse after verse. And just when you think he doesn't know any more verses up there, he'll quote you some more. But it's a big difference between knowing what the Scripture says and understanding what the Scripture says. And I would assume that everybody in this room is evidence of that very point, because you've probably been a believer a lot longer than you've been interested in your Hebrew roots, haven't you? Right? And so you read something one day, one night, one afternoon in the Scripture that had always been there. Nobody snuck it in. It had always been there, but all of a sudden a light came on and you saw something that you had never seen before, and you began to understand things that you had never understood before, because He turned on the light to define and describe for you what you already knew. Right? Now, very important to understand this. No man can teach you that. No man can give you that kind of understanding. Knowledge may come from a person, but understanding comes from on high, according to 1 Corinthians 2. It comes by the Spirit of God, who teaches us, yes, the deep things of God. Because it is written, eye has not seen, ear hasn't heard, neither has it entered into the hearts of man what God has prepared for those who love Him. But He reveals them to us how? By His Spirit. The Spirit gives us understanding. But I would suggest to you that even with the understanding, that's still not enough to get us to the goal. There's one more thing that has to happen. You see, a lot of people want to take their flashlight, and when it gets turned on, all they want to do is going around the room. And they want to pull things out of darkness, and they want to solve all the mysteries of the universe, and they want to say that this is what God means here, and this is what God means here, and I can describe it for you, I can define it for you. Why don't you get this? And they'll go all around the room. And that's all they do. Some people, when they get their flashlight turned on, will run up to Beth here, shine their flashlight in her eyes and say, "Can you see what I see?" If I put a flashlight in your face in pitch black, what do you see? Nothing. You're as blind as if I had never turned the flashlight on. Guess what we've been doing, a lot of folks? We've been running around with our understanding, shining it in somebody's eyes and saying, "How come you can't see what I see?" And then we're amazed that they look at us so strange. They can't see because we're blinding them with it. Some people like to take their flashlight and do this. So knowledge is one thing. Understanding is very important, but there's one more thing we need to appropriate here, folks, and that is called wisdom. And wisdom says this, that I don't take this light that He's given me and just run around the room indefinitely trying to solve all the mysteries of the universe. Wisdom says that I don't take it and try to blind somebody else with it. Wisdom says I do this. We direct it at our path so that we see how we are to walk. Your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto that other guy's path over there. No? A light unto my path. There is a path that has been given to all of us as individuals, as family, and as a corporate body. And so it's imperative that we walk the path that is set before us. The steps of a good man, the steps of a tzaddik, a righteous one, are ordered of God. That means that I have the obligation, responsibility to walk the path that is set before me. And quite frankly, I'm going to stub my toe if all I'm doing is this, or all I'm doing is this. I need to direct that light at my path so that I can fulfill the Father's purposes in my life, in my family, so that we can do that as a corporate body. Because if I take that flashlight, shine it at my path, and I'm navigating all these obstacles through all this darkness, then maybe that's going to inspire this person over here to get their flashlight turned on and directed at their path. And before you know it, two more are doing that. And before you know it, the whole host of people are doing that. And maybe if we were spending more energy doing that instead of some of these other things, then maybe that will inspire those who are groping out of in the darkness there to want to come out of the darkness and in the light too. In other words, if we were all doing what we were supposed to be doing, then maybe we would start to fulfill our mandate as a people, as a nation, and that is this: to be a light to the nations. We're not called to be a blight to the nations, folks. We're called to be a light to the nations. And you cannot be a light to the nations if you are acting like the nations. Now, when I say that, most people assume that I'm talking about, well, I don't murder, and I don't rape, and I don't cheat, and I don't do all this, that, and the other. Well, keep this in mind. The most obvious and blatant forms of wickedness are not the most common forms of wickedness. See, we think murder, rape, baby killers, devil worshipers, people who live in Hollywood, that's wickedness. Yes, those are the most obvious forms of wickedness, but they're not the most blatant forms of wickedness. Again, the adversary didn't come and seduce the woman with those blatant and obvious things. It was those very subtle things. It was those things that took something that looked good and mingled it with something that wasn't. That's the most common form of wickedness. Yeshua said that the way that leads to life, there's a straight gate, it's a narrow path. And how many people find it? Few. And how did he describe the other path? Wide, broad. But you know what we do, I believe? We try to make that broad path narrow. We try to make it baby killers, devil worshipers, and people who live in Hollywood. But it's not just that. It is a wide, broad path that encompasses many things. And again, the most common form of wickedness is not what you think it is. The most common form of wickedness is what you don't think it is. And so when I say that we cannot be a light to the nations if we are acting like the nations, is not to say that we should abstain, or it's not exclusively saying that we should abstain from those obvious things that I just described. How about this? With all of the things that are going on in the world, the prospects for economic collapse and high food prices and skyrocketing energy costs and war and political unrest and all these different things that are going on in the world, what if I decide that I want to get my barrels of wheat, my barrels of water, and my shotgun shells and move to a cave in Montana somewhere? Because that's what people in the world are doing. That's what others are doing. Now, am I saying that we shouldn't be prudent? No, I'm not saying that. I believe in being prudent, but keep in mind that if you put your trust in your wheat and your water and your weapons, sooner or later your wheat's going to run out. Sooner or later your water's going to run dry. And when people find out you have wheat and water, you're going to use up all your shotgun shells. So we cannot be a light to the nations if we are acting like the nations. And so there's one more element of this path that I was describing I'd like to address. You know, in biblical days, they didn't have flashlights, right? They had these little oil lamps. And the last time I was in Israel, I obtained one of those little oil lamps, about 2,000 years old. I remember the last thing the fella told me, he says, Bill, whatever you do, don't light it. So when I got home, and here's one thing that I should have known this, but I didn't realize it until I actually, did it. Is that those oil lamps don't throw out a long beam of light that I can shine down a path to see several feet in front of me. Those little oil lamps put out just enough light that I can see the next step. And then when I take that step, I can see the next step. And then I can see the next step. In other words, I can't see what's way out there in the distance. I don't know what I'm going to encounter. I don't know where this path is going to take me. So with every step in obedience that I take, as evidence that I love you, therefore I keep your commandments, as evidence that I submit my will to yours in obedience to you, with every step that I take, I'm also saying, and because I don't know what's out there, I trust you. I don't know where this path is going to take me. You don't know where this path is going to take you. But when we determine in our hearts to walk this path that is set before us, we are saying not only do we love you, but we trust you. And because I trust you, I will not take matters into my own hands and out of yours. And so I'm not going to move to Montana. No offense to anybody who may be from Montana. So with that, let's go to Exodus chapter 13. We'll begin to read at verse 17. Then it came to pass, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. And so very simply, why doesn't he lead them the straight way, or not the straight way, but the closest way, the shortest route? Because he says, if they see that there are obstacles in the land, if they see that there are Nephilim, if they see that there are all these people in the land with all their fortified cities, and they realize, oh, you know what? We're going to have to fight for this. They're going to want to go back the other direction. Or let's put it this way. They're walking down their path, and they go, uh-oh, I don't like that. And they go back to Egypt. So that's what he sees. And then the next verse says this. So God led the people around by the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up in, New King James says, orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt. So they went up in orderly ranks. Some translations render that in martial array. Some translations render it in fives. Some translations render it this way, fully armed, or armed for battle. The Hebrew term is chamushim. Chamushim, chet, mem, shin, yud, mem. The root chamash is where we get the word chamish, 5. It's also where we get the word chumash. You know what a chumash is, right? It's the book that contains the 5 books of Moses. But isn't it ironic that they come out armed? Armed for what? Well, what do you usually arm yourselves for? For war, don't you? But didn't we just read that he said, if they see war, what are they going to want to do? They want to go back the other way. So I want you to get the picture. They come out of Egypt fully armed. They come out of Egypt. They got their sword in their hand. The only problem is, it's not in their heart. You see, what's in their heart will not sustain what's in their hand. And here's why. What did they witness the night before they left Egypt? The death of the firstborn. And what were they doing inside their homes? They were eating the Passover, weren't they? Because the Creator had told them that on the 14th day of the month, you're to take a male lamb of the first year without spot or blemish. You're going to slaughter it between the evenings. You're going to take a hyssop branch and dip it into the blood and put the blood upon the doorposts and lintels of your home, because I'm going to pass through the land of Egypt tonight, and I'm going to strike down the firstborn of Egypt, both man and beast, from Pharaoh's house down to the prison cell. But when I see the blood, I will pass over you. Now, I've shared this story many times before, and maybe you've heard me, but for those of you who hadn't heard it, here we go. You see, when I was a child, I grew up in a Pentecostal church in Albany, Georgia, and we didn't do Passover. We did ham on Easter Sunday, right? So my introduction to Passover was Cecil B. DeMille, Charlton Heston, Yul Brynner, and Edward G. Robinson. That's what I knew of Passover. And so that movie, there's one of those scenes in the movie that really stuck out in my mind as a kid, and even as a young adult, that kind of introduced me to what Passover was. And that was when Joshua, who is in love with Lilia, who, if you remember the movie, to save Joshua's life, had to come into Edward G. Robinson's house as kind of a, whatever. And Edward G. Robinson is a bad guy. He's Dathan, and he's cooperating with the Egyptians. Lilia is the firstborn, you see, and Joshua knows this, and he realizes that Edward G. Robinson will never put blood on the doorpost, and that would mean that his love, Lilia, would die. So what is he going to do? He's going to take blood over to Edward G. Robinson's house, and he's going to put the blood on the doorpost. Remember? But he has to do it quickly because the green fog is already coming out of the sky. Remember? And so he's quickly doing this, and the green fog comes out of the sky, and it hits the streets, and it starts spreading out through the streets, and people are dropping over dead just 20 feet from Joshua, right? And so he quickly does this. He runs on back to his house, and then the green fog creeps down the street. And then it gets in front of Edward G. Robinson's house. And if you remember, it kind of hesitates, as if to say, what's that blood doing up there? That's Edward G. Robinson's house. Oh, well. And passes on by his house to the next house. So in my mind, I'm thinking that's what it means by I will pass over you. That he would see the blood and realize they're safe and pass over or pass by that house to go to the next house. But that is not what he meant when he said, I will pass over you. It was in the act of a mother hen who sees her chicks and senses there is danger. She will run up to her chicks and extend her wings and will pass over them to bring them under the shelter of her wings. And 1,000 may fall at one hand and 10,000 at the other, but it will not come near unto them because they have made the Lord their refuge and they abide under the shadow of his wings. That's what he meant when he said, I will pass over you. And then Moses says this later. He says, when the Lord passes over you, he will not permit the destroyer to enter into your homes. The destroyer was the green fog. The destroyer passed by because the Creator passed over. And so they're in their homes and they're eating the Passover and they're eating the matzah and they're eating the unleavened bread. And presumably they're hearing screams of terror and death in the night, because the text tells us there was not one house in all of Egypt where there was not a dead body. But he didn't come into their homes. So my point would be this. What redeemed the firstborn out of Egypt? We could say obedience. Because had they not followed his instructions and placed the blood upon that door, then we would have to presume that they would have died if they were firstborn. So we could say obedience. But once you've walked in obedience and put the blood upon the doorpost, then you've got to settle into your home and you've got to trust that because I have done what you've instructed me to do, now you are going to do what you promised you would do. They trusted in him. So in other words, on the night before they left Egypt, they placed their trust in the blood of a lamb and in his word that he would do what he promised to do. And yet on the very next day, he sees them and he says this of them, that if they see war, they're going to want to turn around and go back the other direction. You know what that tells me? They may have trusted him the night before, but they weren't trusting him to possess the land. Because if they had trusted him in that part of their life, when they saw war, what would they do? They would have been like Joshua and Caleb, wouldn't they? You remember Moses, as he's preparing to be gathered into his fathers, he says to them, as they're preparing to go into the land, be strong and of good courage. Why? Because the Lord is with you. Trust in him. So all of this is to say, folks, as we come into this and we're on this trek to fulfill his purposes in our lives as an individual, as a family, as a people, I believe that we've come to the place that we need to stop running around the room trying to find the answer to every question we may have, if that is going to keep us from doing what we were placed here to do. The time has come for us to quit shining our light in everybody's eyes and blinding them with it. The time has come for us to take this light that we have been given, this understanding that we've been privileged to have, and to appropriate it for the purpose for which it was given. Because he gave this to us so that we would fulfill his purposes in the earth, not my agenda. In other words, I believe it's still true that for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever should believe in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. I believe that's still true today. I believe it's still true that he is long-suffering, not willing that any should perish, but all that should come to repentance. I believe that his mercies are still new every morning, and I, for one, am very thankful for that. I don't know about you. In other words, I believe that his mandate has not changed just because we've got a larger amount of understanding. The purpose is still the same, for us to function and be a light to the nations, to be a light in the midst of darkness, to walk this path that he set before us. Yes, in submission to his will. Yes, in obedience to his commands. But yes, proving to him every day, I trust you, even though I don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. Now, why is this important to us? Let's go to 1 Corinthians 10 very quickly. For the sake of time, I'm not going to read it all, but there's something very interesting that Paul has to say here. He says, verse 1, moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, all ate the same spiritual food, all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Messiah. But with most of them, God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. May I put an addendum on here? He wasn't pleased with any of them, except two. Out of all those 600,000 men that left Egypt, only two of them entered into the land. Moses didn't enter the land. Aaron didn't enter the land. Two of them. So it's kind of an understatement that Paul makes here. But with some of them, no, with all but two of them, Paul, he was not well pleased. And it goes on and it says, now these things became our examples to the intent, or for the purpose, that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. Well, what did they lust after? They didn't lust after sex, drugs, and rock and roll necessarily. You'll remember that there comes a place where they said, you know what, Moses? Look, we're out here in the desert and there's no sea, there's no water, there's nothing out here. You haven't brought us out of a land, you haven't brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey. You brought us out of a land flowing with milk and honey. You remember this? And they said basically this, I'll paraphrase it. All we have is this detestable bread, and we've had it up to here with it. We want some meat. We want some substance. We want something we can really sink our teeth into. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, But I seem to remember that when they came out of Egypt, they didn't leave one hoof behind. That means they had livestock with them. You see, they weren't lusting after meat per se. They were lusting after the meat that Egypt had to provide, because the quail came from the direction of the sea they just passed through. When they left Egypt, the quail came from Egypt, ladies and gentlemen. And so here's what they were saying. Well, back in Egypt, we had Taco Bell and KFC and Pizza Hut. Or green chili for my New Mexican friends here. They were, that's enough now. They were lusting after the things that Egypt had to offer, not what the Creator had to offer. So that's how they were lusting after evil things. There's nothing inherently evil with wanting to eat meat. It's what it was tied to. They were lusting after evil things. He goes on and he says, do not become idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written. The people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And we'd kid ourselves sometimes to think that we don't have idols in our lives. He goes on and he says, nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. And in one day, 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Messiah. Some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. And maybe some people would think, well, I haven't done any of those things. Well, read verse 10. Nor complain. Nor complain of some of them also complain, and get this, were destroyed by the destroyer. In other words, were destroyed by the same destroyer that had earlier passed by their homes when the Father passed over them. Why was the destroyer not permitted to come into their homes before? Because they trusted in Him. So why do you think it is that they were destroyed by the destroyer in the wilderness? Because why were they complaining? Why were they complaining about no water, no food, no this, no that? Why were they complaining? What's at the heart of it? They don't really believe Him. They don't really trust Him. They don't think He's going to bring them into a land. They don't think He can do it. What have you? It was a lack of trust. So how important is it, do you think, to not only walk in the commandments, to do them, but to understand why you're doing them? You see, when Israel came out of Egypt, they looked like they were a mighty army. They were armed on the outside. But guess what? They weren't on the inside. I have hidden your word in my heart that I might not sin against you. Which leads me to believe that if you only hide it in your head, then you still will sin against Him. It has to be hidden in your heart. And so if you're all about knowledge and you're hiding it there, then guess what? You're going to hit a brick wall sooner or later. And I might as well go ahead and get into this. My opinion is the reason we have so many people who come into this and then end up abandoning the Messiah or saying that Messiah is just a man is because it's all here. They're trying to intellectualize all of this. And when they can't see it here in their head, they can't understand how He is one, and yet the Messiah and He and the Father are one, and yet Yeshua is praying to the Father, and all these things, because they can't intellectualize it and they can't articulate it with their tongue, then some people dismiss it. You see, folks, it is my firm conviction that there are some things in this word you will never understand with your head until the Messiah sits us down in the kingdom. And by the way, when He does, there's going to be a lot of jaws dropping and a head slapping. Oh, I was way off on that. You mean it wasn't that? It was a sliver? I mean, whatever it is. There are some things that can only be understood with the heart. Thomas said, unless I am able to take my hand and feel those wounds, I won't believe. So 7 days later, the Messiah shows up and says, come on, Thomas, you come touch these wounds. He puts His hand into His side, falls to his knees and says, my Lord and my God. And here's what Yeshua says. Thomas, you believe because you've seen. Or let's put it this way. You believe, Thomas, because Your eyes saw me. And that sent a signal to your brain, to your intellect, that said, yeah, this is real. And then your fingers touched me, and the nerve endings in your fingers sent a signal up to your brain that says, you're touching something real. This is for real. You can believe this because your brain said to believe it, Thomas. But blessed are those who have not seen and yet who have believed. Why? Because those are the folks that believe it in their heart. There's some things, folks, that you cannot teach somebody. There are things that you cannot learn from another man. There are things that the only way you're going to be able to learn them is if you take that lamp that you've been given and you take that step, and then you take that next step, and then you take that next step, and with every step of obedience you take, you also learn, I can trust him because he has proven himself to be true every step of the way. That's the way it works. And I'm going to be quite blunt with you. There are some folks in the church that are farther down the road on that than we are. And I probably just offended half of you. But that's the truth. There are some things that can only be understood with the heart. Yes, I meditate upon your Torah night and day, and we should. And yes, it's going to manifest itself on the outside. I not only need to come out of Egypt looking like an army on the outside, but it needs to be a true reflection of what's on the inside. You see, their sword was in their hand, but remember, again, it wasn't in their heart. Their chumash was in their hand, but was it in their heart? And you can ask yourself that question. Because I firmly believe that unless it's in your heart, then you really can't fulfill your purpose. We can't do what we were placed here to do if it's all about what it looks like on the outside. What it looks like on the outside needs to be a true reflection of what it is on the inside. Because folks, this path that we're on, we are going to encounter some things that most of us would rather not have to encounter. And as these crises unfold, and as it begins to affect each and every one of us in some capacity, here's what's going to happen. Or let me rephrase that. Here's what's not going to happen. The crisis is not going to make the man or the woman. The crisis is going to reveal the man or the woman. Why, again, is it so important that we understand this? Because Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed, lest he fall. So I'll paraphrase what I believe Paul is saying to those who are living at the end of the age. Well, first of all, I guess I should ask, how many of you agree with me that we are living in the end of the age? 1, 2, 3. A good number of you. So if we believe that we're living in the end of the age, then Paul is saying to us, pay attention to what these people did and to what these people didn't do. Learn from their mistakes. And if he's telling us to learn from their mistakes and don't repeat their mistakes, it would seem to suggest that we, living at the end of the age, are going to be given an opportunity to repeat the same mistakes or to learn from them. And what was their fundamental error? It wasn't about what they knew or didn't know. How many of you have ever seen a mountain on fire and the voice of God coming from the midst of a dark cloud? How many of that ever happened to you? I've never seen that. I've never heard the audible voice of God. Never have. See, they had a lot of knowledge. They had seen a lot of things. They had a lot of experiences. But that doesn't mean they trusted him. So I believe their fundamental flaw, by and large, was they didn't trust him. Well, how could you say they didn't trust him when they trusted him the night that they observed the Passover? I want to use Abram to answer that question. And we won't read again for the sake of time, but everybody's familiar with the story of Avram. And where do we find him in Genesis 12? Where did he come from? Ur of the Kasdim, or the Chaldeans. And who are the Chaldeans? What's another name? Babylonians. So when he's called to leave country, family, father's house, he's essentially called to come out of Babylon. Well, isn't that interesting? Because that's exactly what the seed of Abraham are called to do, to come out of Babylon. And that's what we're doing, right? By the way, we have not come out of Babylon. We are coming out, perhaps, but we have not come out. We're all still tainted in some way. So we're coming out of Babylon. And he was called to come out of Babylon to go to a place, to a land that I'm going to show you. That seems to tell me that initially, anyway, Avram wasn't really certain where he was going. That tells me this, that he had his little lamp and he was taking one step at a time. And wherever this path led him, that's where he went. Until he comes to a river called the Yarden, the Jordan, and then he crosses over the Jordan, Avar. And after he crosses over the Jordan, he gets a new identity. He's called Avraham. And he's going to be referred to from this point on as Ha'ivri, the Hebrew, because he's the one who crossed over. Just like many of us. We're coming out of Babylon. And guess what? We read one day, or when the light came on, we saw Shabbats for everybody. The Moedim are for all of his people. I can't eat pork chops anymore. By the way, you know, there's some things in the book I wish were not there. I'm just being honest. I know that none of you would ever admit that. But there's some things in there I just soon weren't there. Because it would never, because I would never have to be challenged to overcome my own will and my own flesh. But he did. He overcame that. He crossed over. He becomes known as Ha'ivri, the Hebrew. And in today, we have people who've crossed over and they've come into their identity, understanding who they are in Messiah, what that truly and really means, and somehow come to the conclusion, well, we've arrived. I have attained all wisdom and all knowledge. And the answer is, no, we have not. And we find that in the story of Avram, or Avraham. Because once he crossed over into the land in Genesis 12, we see that a famine came to the land of Canaan that forces him and all who are with him to go down into Egypt. Remember? Now, as he's walking down to Egypt, as he approaches the border of Egypt, we are told, and now this is Bill's translation, okay? We are told that he begins to think about the Egyptians and their reputation for liking beautiful women. And he looks over at Sarah. Yeah, she's beautiful. And as they get closer, he begins to put all this together. And he realizes, wait a minute. When we get down here into Egypt and they see my beautiful wife, they're going to want to kill me and take my wife. Honey, I've been thinking. When we get down here into Egypt, you know how those rascals like beautiful women. And there's none prettier than you, Cupcake. So, I think it would be in your best interests if when we get down here into Egypt, we don't tell them we're husband and wife, because if they kill me, what's going to become of you, honey? So we need to tell them that we're brother and sister, and that's technically not a lie. It's just not telling them the whole truth. Right? So he gets down into Egypt. This is the story they go with. And what happens? The Egyptians report her beauty to Pharaoh, who abducts her, takes her into his house, and apparently has designs on marrying her. And if he's going to marry her, then you know, ... And so who put her in this very precarious situation? Her husband. Her husband did. And what do you think motivated her husband to hatch this plan? Self-preservation. So may I put it this way, with all due respect to Avram? Fear for his own life prompted him to come up with this plan. Now, if he's fearful for his own life, and that prompts him to develop this plan, that tells me, this is the way I see it, he took matters into his own hands. And if he took matters into his own hands, that means he took them out of someone else's hands. Right? And what does that tell me? That in this part of his life, he didn't trust the way he should. Well, how can you say that? He left Babylon. He went to the land. Yeah, he sure did, and he did it just like that. I'm not putting Avram down here. I'm just relating to you what the scripture, I believe, is trying to show us. That there were points in his life that he did trust the Creator, but there were also parts of his life where he didn't. And the Creator knows that Abraham has a destiny on the top of Mount Moriah in Genesis chapter 22, when he truly is going to have to prove that he loves his master, that there is nothing that he would withhold from him. And so he doesn't take him right to Mount Moriah, does he? Because you see, our Father knows us better than we do. And so this path that he was on led him into a circumstance that exposed within him that there was an area of his life where he did not trust the Creator as he should. Now the men would say, well, look what happened. I mean, everything turned out all right. He got all these gifts and, he's not really chastised or anything except by Pharaoh. Yeah, look what happened. Exactly. Getting to that. But I want to make this point. Now, this is, again, my opinion. You can disagree with this if you want to. But you know what? I believe that when the Creator knows your heart, when he really knows your heart and what you really desire to be and want to do, then, I believe he will protect you even when you're stupid. How many of you can testify that he's protected you even when you were stupid? He continues to do it in my case. So I'm not suggesting that Abraham was this, rogue. No, I'm just suggesting that he's like us in that he was a man with flaws and faults, and the Creator lovingly created circumstances to expose those flaws, not to embarrass the man, but to bring the man to the place where he realizes this as well, so that the man will then do what? Overcome those flaws, overcome those faults. Because we are called to be overcomers, right? By the way, not survivors. Everybody's wanting to survive. We're not called to be survivors. We're called to be overcomers. And it seems to me that if you're going to be an overcomer, there has to be something to overcome. And by the way, my biggest obstacle is not a guy in a red suit with a pitchfork. My biggest obstacle is this guy right here. We got to press toward the mark of the high calling of God. And if you're going to press toward the high mark of the calling of God, that means there is resistance. There's something that says, no, I'm going to resist this. We have to press toward that mark. We have to overcome these things. And so the Father, I believe, lovingly exposes those parts of his life where he has to overcome his fear of self-preservation, taking matters into his own hands, which, by the way, if you're going to survive the things that are coming and your idea is to run to Montana with your wheat, your water, and your weapons, that might be taking matters into your own hands. That might be taking them out of his hands. Maybe. Messianics like to scoff, ridicule, mock Christians who believe in a pre-trib rapture. And I'm not a pre-trib guy. I'm okay if it happens that way. I'm good with it. I'm not counting on it. But we have a tendency to want to ridicule people because they think they're going to get out of here before anything bad happens. Well, explain to me, what's the difference in getting out this way, wanting to get out this way before anything bad happens, and wanting to hightail it to Montana or Costa Rica before anything bad happens? It's still wanting to take matters into your own hands. And here's what happens when you take matters into your own hands. You end up with Hagar. Because when she was abducted and went into Pharaoh's house, when he found out that she's actually married to this guy by the name of Avram, he says, why didn't you tell me you were married? Now look what kind of a position you put me in. And so he bestows all these gifts on him. Okay, I'm making up for this. And one of those gifts just happens to be an Egyptian handmaid by the name of Hagar. So a few years down the road, guess what? They take matters into their own hands again. You know, honey, I don't think that we can afford to wait any longer on this promise to come true. So why don't you take Hagar? You know how we got her, remember? Honey? Because you ladies don't forget anything. Nothing. So you just take Hagar in there. You have relations with her. She'll have a son, and we'll raise this son as our own. Of course, in Bill's mind, he sees Abraham hearing all of this. And he's looking at Sarah going, are you for real? Is this a joke? For real? Well, honey, if you think that's the thing we need to do, but what is the result? Ishmael. And how has that worked out for everybody? So I'm going to suggest to you that if Abram goes into Egypt and doesn't take matters into his own hands, but believes that the Lord can protect him in this situation too, and says, this is my wife, then there is no Hagar that goes back with him into the land of Canaan. If there's no Hagar, there is no Ishmael. You see, there are consequences for not trusting. But ultimately, Abram becomes Abraham, and he is called to the top of Mount Moriah in Genesis 22. And we don't have time to develop all of this, but the bottom line is this. In Genesis 22, on the top of Mount Moriah, we see a man who exhibits to the Creator that there is nothing in which he doesn't trust him. There is no part of his life in which he is willing to hold on to. He's going to give it all into his hands, even if it's his only son that he loves. And more than just a son, he is the promise, because if Isaac dies, the promise dies with him. And so there's nothing he withholds from him. And in this, the Creator says, now I know that you are a man who fears God, and that you have not withheld your only son from me. But you see, the Creator knew that he was going to bring him to that mountain when he called him out of Babylon in Genesis 12. And though the man in Genesis 12 is not the same man in Genesis 22, the same Creator knew that that's where that path was going to take him. It's just that path, or along that path, Abraham had to encounter things that were going to challenge him to overcome his will, to die to himself more than before, more than just coming out of Babylon, more than just becoming a Hebrew. It was dying to who he was so that he could be what he was created to be. We're called, folks, not as a validation of who we are. We are called as a challenge to become who we are not, but to walk in the fullness of his purposes, to truly be a light in the midst of darkness. And Abraham's story demonstrates to us that this path that we're on, we're going to have to encounter things that we don't want to encounter. We're going to have to come face to face with things about our own lives that we really don't want to have to acknowledge. And that's where people turn around and they go back to Egypt. Because they're always sitting ready to go back to Egypt, aren't they? I mean, when they come out of Egypt, they haven't even crossed the sea yet. Remember? They're at the sea. They can't turn to the right. They can't turn to the left. Pharaoh's chariots are behind them. And remember, Edward G. Robinson walked up to Moses. Were there no graves in Egypt? See, you brought us out into the wilderness to die, see? A couple of these young kids here are looking at me like, I guess today it would be Lady Goo Goo or whatever her name is. I don't know. Lady Goo. Anyway. They were always ready to go back to Egypt, or some of them were always ready to go back to Egypt. Well, guess what? We're no different than they are. When we encounter these obstacles, that it's going to come down to not what we know, but who we know. And do we really trust Him? Don't be surprised if some people head back to Egypt. But you know what? I hope and pray that we all do, is we learn to overcome those things and to trust Him even more, because there's a greater test coming. Go with me to Daniel chapter 1. How many of you are still out there? All right. How many of you aren't still out there? No, I'm just... All right, Daniel chapter 1. In Daniel chapter 1, we see that Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem. He destroyed the city, as we know. And it says, and the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. And that he carried many of the temple treasures out of Jerusalem back to Babylon, and he set these temple treasures in the house of his God. That is an idol, a house of pagan worship. The temple articles. But here's the point. Who allowed this to happen? Who delivered Jehoiakim into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did. Who allowed the temple to be destroyed? The Creator did. Who allowed these vessels that were set apart for holy purposes to be desecrated and to be displayed in the house of an idol? The Creator did. And here is why, in part, I believe He did that. Why He allowed Judah to become captives in Babylon. It's because He just placed them physically where their hearts already were. Their hearts were already there just in some form or fashion. And it's really important that we understand what Babylon really is. It's not necessarily sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's about taking things that are good and mingling them with evil. Babylon is the epitome of mixing and mingling. Or let's put it in today's jargon. Babylon is the epitome of coexistence, tolerance, social justice. That's what Babylon is. That's the mindset. Babylon wants you to get a blue bumper sticker that says coexist and put it on the back of your car. That's what Babylon is. And so that's where their hearts were, and so that's where they ended up physically. But among them, there were these sons of Israel. And specifically, let's look in verse 6. There are those men, these sons of Israel, these nobles who go into Nebuchadnezzar's academy to learn the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. And after 3 years, they were going to see if they can serve before the king. And so in verse 6, it says, now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, while we're focused on the 4 names, pay attention to what we probably passed right over. Now, from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So what does that tell me? There were others of the sons of Judah who went into Nebuchadnezzar's academy to learn the language and the literature of the Chaldeans, and who at the end of 3 years are going to presumably serve before the king, who along with these 4 men are going to be given a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank. But only 4 of them apparently purposed in their heart that they would not defile themselves with the king's meat or with his wine. So how come those 4 are the only ones mentioned doing that of all those other sons of Judah? I have to conclude that those other guys aren't mentioned because they defiled themselves. And we will assume that all of these sons of Judah worshiped at the same temple. There was only one. We'll assume that they knew of the same Creator, had the same text that these 4 men did, had the same heritage. But I'll recommend to you the distinction is this. One group had it in their head. A remnant had it in their heart. They purposed in their heart. Consider what they had witnessed. These men watched their country fall apart. They saw their nation crumbling. They saw their capital destroyed. They saw everything that they had ever trusted in, revered, and held dear. Every bit of it, they saw it falling apart. They saw it destroyed ultimately because they had chosen as a people to put their trust in anything and everything except the one that they were to trust. And so perhaps one by one, component after component of their lives, of their national fabric, begin to crumble, begin to implode upon itself and dissolve into chaos. And then finally, they observed a tyrant, an oppressor, destroy everything they'd ever believed in. You see, as a nation, somewhere along the way, they had abandoned the founding principles, those things that brought the nation into existence in the first place. Because over time, people begin to focus on the blessing rather than the one who blesses. They begin to take things for granted, and somehow they delude themselves into thinking that we were responsible for all of this. And so when they begin to think this way, and they begin to get blue bumper stickers that said coexist and put them on the back of their car, when they begin to call for tolerance and social justice, let us all come together and mix and mingle with one another, and let's just all get along and be one big happy family, and everybody gave their hearts over to that, that's when they saw their nation begin to crumble and to fall. And so they end up where their hearts already were. But among them, there were 4 men who purposed in their heart that even though this path has led us to this place, do you think that those 4 men, if they would have been allowed to choose that this is where we would end up, that's what they would choose to be or where they would be? Of course not. They wouldn't go anywhere near it. But the path that they've been walking has brought them to that place. And so now they have a choice to make. Do we just succumb? Do we give up all hope and just give in and go ahead and eat the king's delicacies? Do we just go ahead and go with the trends? Or do we purpose in our heart, we're not going to eat the king's delicacies and we're not going to drink the king's wine? And at the end of 10 days, they are found to be fairer or healthier than everybody else. And so what did they learn out of that? That if we do what he has instructed us to do, he will continue to do what he has promised he would do. And as a reward, these men serve before the king. And if you read the text, you will see that these men stand out head and shoulders above everybody else. Nebuchadnezzar knows who these guys are. And so then in Daniel 2, when he has a dream that he can't understand or can't interpret, and he's forced to bring Daniel to give him the interpretation of the dream, and Daniel tells him the dream of the image, the head of gold, the chest and arms of silver, the belly and thighs of brass, the 2 iron legs with the 2 feet, 10 toes, iron mingled with clay. And he says, you, king, are the head of gold. See, apparently Nebuchadnezzar really liked himself, because in the next chapter, chapter 3, he doesn't make an image of gold, silver, brass, and iron, does he? He makes an image entirely of gold. What I believe is to say he made an image of himself. He set it up in the plain of Dura, and he commanded everybody to bow down and worship the image. I don't care what your religion says. I don't care what your background says. I don't care what your conviction says. This is the law. Bow or die. And among all these governors, administrators, and satraps, and these notable men, which we will assume includes some of those other men of Judah who went into Nebuchadnezzar's academy, everybody starts to bow down, except 3. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. who of course are summoned before Nebuchadnezzar, who knows these men, and he compels them. He coerces. He does everything in his power to try to convince them to bow down and worship the image, keep the law. And so Bill's translation of the response goes something like this. You know, King, we didn't choose to be here. It's the result of our disobedience. But while we're here, we have tried to be good citizens. We've tried to obey the laws. In fact, we've given you advice on how to run your kingdom. We haven't been forming political parties and political movements. We haven't been out there on the picket line with our bullhorns and calling for the overthrow of the government, or we haven't been out there campaigning against this guy in November or for that one in November. We haven't been doing that. But you see, now you passed the law that we can't obey, because this law would compel us to break a higher law. You see, while we understand that you are a King of Kings, we understand that we serve the King of Kings, and he's the one who raised you up, and he's the one that can bring you down. And so if we were to bow to your laws, we would break his, and this we cannot do. And so this path has led us to a place that we must now decide that we will obey God rather than man, regardless of what the circumstances and consequences are. You can destroy our bodies, but he has the authority to cast both body and soul into hell. And so if it means we must lay down our lives today in obedience to him, then so be it. We believe that he is able to deliver us from your hand. But if not, we still won't bow down. And so these are men who do not seek to save their lives. Because the one who seeks to save his life will lose it. The one who takes matters into his own hands is the one who's seeking to save his life. Because that man, that woman is taking things out of the hands of the Creator. And that says, in this part of my life, I don't trust you. But these men put their lives in the hands of the Creator. And so when they refused to bow down, we see that in verse 19 of Daniel 3, the Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression on his face changed towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain men of valor who were in his army to bind them and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. And these men were bound and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Verse 22 says, therefore, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? And they answered and said to the king, true, O king. Look, he answered, I see 4 men, loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Then Nebuchadnezzar went near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke, saying, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God. Folks, that statement does not happen if they bow down. It doesn't happen. Think of it this way. The head of gold is Babylon, right? The head of gold is Babylon. That's where all the rest of the body gets its marching orders. That's where it gets its influence from. And so on that head, not only are there ears, not only are there eyes and nose, but there's a mouth. And what is the mouth of that image that represents all the nations that stand in defiance of the God of Israel? What does that mouth speak? That he is the Most High God. You see, every knee shall bow. Every tongue will confess. But it doesn't happen if they bow down. Now let me suggest something to you, or ask you a question. Do you think it's possible, remotely, that the creator of the universe knew that Nebuchadnezzar was going to have a dream that he didn't understand. Oh, that's right. He's the one who gave him the dream. And giving him the dream, knowing he was not going to understand, do you think the creator knew that he was going to be forced to call Daniel to interpret the dream for him? And maybe, upon learning the dream's meaning, maybe he would be puffed up in his heart and say, you know what, I'm going to build me an image, not of gold, silver, brass, and iron. I'm going to make one entirely of gold, and I'm going to pass a law that everybody has to bow down to me. Is it possible he knew that? And so is it possible he knew that for every knee and every tongue to confess, that he needed a remnant who were not willing to bow down? He needed them to be willing to walk a path that, given their own choices, they would not have ended up in Babylon, but they obediently walked every step in front of them in obedience and submission and exhibiting that we don't really understand what's going on or why, but we trust you. Because he was going to need those men to set an example so that Babylon would have to confess that he is the Most High God. And so we continue to read, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire, and the satraps, administrators, governors, and the king's counselors gathered together. And they saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. And Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. How many times did Messiah say, woman, because you know how to pronounce the name Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, you are made whole? Sir, because your calendar is correct, you are delivered. How many times? Not one, but how many times did he say your trust has made you whole? Your trust has saved you. Your trust has healed you. How many times? Every time he did something like that. And so, how were these men delivered? Not because of what they knew, but because of who they knew. And they knew that no matter the circumstance, even if it means laying down my life, I still can trust him. And so if it was that way then guess what? It remains that way today. There are things that are going on in the world. There are things that are going on in the nation this week that causes people to shudder, myself included. Darkness is descending upon the land. But he still looks for those who will acknowledge that even though darkness is descending upon the land, he is the one who created darkness. He created it to serve his purposes. And who will, in this day and time, when this darkness is coming upon the land, who will continue to trust him? Who will continue to stand? And when you've done all you can do to stand, stand. And so you see, I'm not trying to figure out who the Antichrist is going to be. I'm not trying to figure out when the tribulation is going to begin. I'm not counting chemtrails. I'm not getting a map of all the FEMA camps and seeing how many guillotines are in there and burning up my Facebook page to get everybody all worked up over this. Because that's not what my focus is to be. This is not my focus. This isn't. This is. One last thing and I'll leave. I'm out of time. But Yeshua said there will be sign in the sun, moon, and stars, and on the earth distress of nations, which, as far as I'm concerned, it's pretty distressing right now. With perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them from fear and from the anticipation of the things that are coming upon the earth. For the powers of the heavens will be shaken. But when you see these things begin to happen, we are to look up. Lift up our head, implying what? Don't get your focus on Obamacare. Don't get your focus on immigration laws. Don't get your focus on political upheavals and economic collapse and rising food prices and all these other things. Don't get your focus on those things, Because if you get your focus on those things, you're going to gravitate toward those things, and before you know it, you're going to be sucked into a big black hole. No, that's not where our focus is to be. Our focus is to be on Him, because if we focus on Him, we walk this path that is set before us. We place our trust and confidence in Him and nothing else. Then, and only then, will we fulfill our purpose of being a light in the midst of darkness. These three men were surrounded by darkness, and yet, because they were willing to be the light, others saw that light as well. Amen? Shabbat Shalom. Thanks for coming out this evening.